from wherever they travel within about a 5-mile radius. And for example, YS Organic Bee Company in Illinois has within recent times stopped certifying their bee pollen because they can no longer claim that it's not transgenic. So you're getting transgenic bee pollen, transgenic honey, and the bees, because they're ingesting it, they become transgenic, just like an animal becomes transgenic through whatever they eat. And nobody has ever done studies in this country to really thoroughly understand this. What happened originally in 1992 was Dan Quayle stood up on behalf of the George H.W. Bush administration and said these crops are generally recognized as safe. And they did that under a basic doctrine of substantial equivalence. That the claim was that, and this was based on a study by the National Academy of Sciences, that these transgenic crops were substantially equivalent to other crops. And yet, they also argue that they're so unique that they deserve a patent. And particular powers. It's not just a patent, because there's before they had utility patents on transgenic crops, there were plant patents. But you see, as a result of a case referred to as the Chakrabarty case, which gave the right to patent a bacterium that was genetically engineered bacterium that was had the ability to assimilate oil, so it could be used in oil spills. That case gave them the right to patent that bacterium, and from that the door was opened to patent other transgenic products, and thus we are where we are now. So, having not had before the U.S. government any true safety evaluation of or long-term health studies, their studies are 90-day studies. They wanted to hurry the products into market, so they put out the contracts. And to go back to that story, a lot of these land grant research institutions are dependent on their money across the country. Not only that, but the president of South Dakota State University is on the Monsanto board. He makes more money as a board member of Monsanto than he does as president of the university. And he has fired people that have stood up against Monsanto, or they have. It wasn't actually him, it was the department chairman in this case, fired a faculty member who stood up against Monsanto's interests. And I've talked to professors in other states who tell me that their deans have said to them, if you, for example, there's a professor or a researcher who I know in a state university who is an organic farmer on the side, heavily committed to the organic ideal, and his dean has told him if he speaks a word against the transgenic agricultural system, he's lost his job. So this kind of heavy-handed tactics is definitely out there. As soon as Don Huber spoke up on his issues in retirement, there came from people at Purdue a whole collection of them signing a study saying that there was no validation of anything that Don Huber has been saying. And yet, he does have a fairly large collection of people that are working with him, and they have now been able to get some USDA money to do the studies that they need to do on this. Just last week, Dr. Mercola, this is www.mercola.com, released the second of 2 one-hour interviews with Dr. Huber, and it is a massive indictment of the entire transgenic agricultural system, including the heavy use of glyphosate. Now, to say a few words about that, I don't know what background you may have on this, but glyphosate is a powerful chelator, and it's been known to be a chelator ever since it was first discovered back in the 60s. So its characteristics are, you know, we've always been told you don't need to worry about Roundup because it dissipates in the soil as soon as it's done its job. Well, what it does is it chelates the minerals in the soil. That's how it dissipates. It chelates the minerals in the soil, including the major minerals, manganese and others that the plant needs to defend its immune system, and that the animals and people who eat the crops need to defend their immune system. So you also chelate the micronutrients. And you affect the bacteria and fungi in the soil, which also can take up the transgenes. So that if you have, for example, a transgenic crop that you've grown in a field this year, and then want to grow something else next year, a non-transgenic crop, you can convey through the soil bacteria and fungi the transgenes to the new crop that you grow in that field. And that also has been reported. So there are many aspects of this. Mostly people have talked about the pollination issue through wind, but they don't talk about the other kinds of ways that problems can be caused. Of course, the early crops that they put out were largely self-pollinating crops, so they reduced the problem of large-scale contamination. Rice, for example, not a Monsanto crop, but nonetheless one that caused a problem with that Starlink rice. Or no, it's Liberty Link rice, Starlink corn, and that's a crop that's about 99% self-pollinating. I'm not a rice grower, but that's my understanding of it. And yet that 1% got that transgenic rice into the consumer market. Same thing with the corn. When the Starlink corn got into the tacos and other things, that had not been released for human consumption, and yet it became contaminated. Corn is another crop, as you all, if you grow corn, know, is a substantially self-pollinating crop. So they had, they started with those crops. You can see the alfalfa issue as being the opening of the door wider to a crop that is contaminated more easily by insects and depends on insects. It also, I know people who grow alfalfa in highly windy places, and they say that there definitely is wind-driven pollen distribution in alfalfa. I haven't experienced that myself just because of the way that my own involvement with alfalfa has been, but that has been told to me by farmers who have to face like 50 mile-an-hour winds at times when they've got bloom on their alfalfa. So plant pathologists like Huber say that because of the way this works in the pollination of alfalfa, they expect to have all alfalfa contaminated within about 5 years. It's that serious an issue. And because it's a crop that's fed so widely to meat animals, that means that the meat is transgenic also. So that's why we feel that it's so extremely important that we bring this suit against this company and try to get it in a place where we can get a hearing that we can't get before the government, either before the executive branch or the Congress or before the agencies. It's standard practice, EPA, across the board, to allow companies, even without the existence of patents, they, as a matter of policy, let those companies do the safety testing on their products. And you don't get any independent, thorough testing. This picks up some of the discussion that we got into and I walked in on in the last session, I suppose. Anyway, the first thing that we're going to claim in defense of in explaining why we need to have protection, a declaratory judgment against the patent infringement problem, is that the patents are invalid. We argue off the bat that they should never have been issued. And we want now the back and forth that wasn't possible in the Patent and Trademark Office to see whose arguments come out on top on that. After that, there are three other arguments that have never been introduced before that claim, and we think that this is very logical, that there shouldn't ever be patent infringement based on what is called in patent law a strict liability. In patent law, just the possession of the patented object makes you eligible to be sued. Well, we argue that in this case that strict liability standard ought not to be applicable, and we're making a series of arguments about why that is true. And then we argue that the Monsanto patents ought not to be enforceable because